Hey everybody, our narrative lectionary reading for this upcoming Sunday is from Ezra. And it's several different verses, so check the description so that you can see what the reading actually is for this week. A lot of time has passed between our reading from last week and this week. And so where we kind of left off before in Jeremiah was the people of Israel were about to be taken into captivity. And so what's happened since then is the people indeed were taken into captivity. Babylon captured Jerusalem and completely ruined the whole place, like brought it down to the rubble on the ground. Destroyed the temple, took all the things out of the temple, and took the people off and brought them to Babylon. And there's stories about things that happened in Babylon too, but this one actually picks up after Babylon was then defeated by the Persian Empire, and then King Cyrus became king, and it was during King Cyrus's first year that he decided to release the people of Israel. And it's kind of an interesting, why would King Cyrus do this? He, in general, had a policy of letting people worship how they wanted to worship. And so it could be a piece of that, but he didn't just let them worship. He sent them off with gold and gave them an edict that said, you're going to go build a temple for God for me. You almost wonder in the way you read it, was Cyrus a believer? Because he goes back and forth between speaking of the Israelites' God as his God and then speaking as the God of the Israelites. And so it leaves some ambiguity there that I don't have any answers for. But of course, the people of Israel are excited. They go back to their home and they live in villages around Jerusalem. And the seventh month of the year, the Jewish year, was coming up, and this was the month about halfway through. On the 14th or 15th of the month, they would celebrate Sukkot. And Sukkot was a celebration. It was a harvesting celebration where they would pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and they would all live in tents. And it was this time when they would remember that once upon a time they had been freed from Egypt, and they lived in the wilderness, and they wandered in the wilderness, living in tents for 40 years, and God lived there with them. And so that was why they would pilgrimage to Jerusalem, because that was where the house of God was at that time. And so they would put their tents around the city of Jerusalem, and they would live there for 8 days. And this is a celebration that's about to happen. And so the people from these villages around Jerusalem that have been freed all come to Jerusalem, but Jerusalem's not really there anymore. It's just ruins. But they go through the motions, and they set up their tents, and they arrived early, essentially. And so they started to work that month. At the beginning of the seventh month, they started to work on rebuilding pieces of the temple. They started with the altar, and they found a place for the altar, and they made sacrifices to God, and they celebrated Sukkot. I think what's interesting and what catches me about this text, and it's almost hard to see, and you've got to read around the text from the narrative lectionary and read the context a little bit to get some of this. But what stood out was the people in the surrounding areas, the neighbors essentially, saw what the Jewish people were doing, and they decided that they wanted to offer help. And so they came to the people and they said, "Hey, we see that you're rebuilding this temple. We want to help you. Let us help." And the Jewish people were like, "No, this is our thing. We don't want you to have anything to do with it." And the text tells us that they were scared of the neighbors, that the neighboring people scared them. And so they were offering sacrifices to God in response to that fear to some extent. And what I find interesting about this is who were their neighbors at this point? Well, 70 years ago, when they were taken into captivity, the kingdom of Babylon did not take everyone. They took the wealthy and the rulers and the rich and the priests, and they took all of those people, but it tells us that they left behind the poor farmers to continue to farm the land. And Babylon also had a policy of moving people around, and so it's very likely that it was a mix of descendants of these farmers and it was also some people from other countries that were brought to Jerusalem as part of Babylon's moving of people. That was just part of their policies. However, it's very unlikely that those that didn't have any connection to the Jewish people would offer to help with the temple or would even understand what they were doing. And so I have to assume that the people who are offering help are people who are from the same family. These are Jewish people. These are part of the people who used to live around and near or descendants of the people who lived in Jerusalem before it was taken captivity. But they're scared of them, and so they say, no, we don't want you to have anything to do with this. And I can't help but think that this is very likely the argument that ends up coming up. These farmers who are left, they had to continue their faith in some way, and so they very likely started to worship on the mountaintops, like the kingdom of Israel did when Judah and Israel split. And they started to pick up some of those practices because there was no temple anymore to worship at. And so I suspect that these people are the people that are later called Samaritans in the New Testament. And Jesus had this encounter with a Samaritan woman once, and they're talking at a well, and the Samaritan woman brings this tension up to Jesus and says, look, my people say that we're supposed to worship on the mountaintop, the mountain we're standing on, as a matter of fact, right now. And your people say that we're supposed to worship in Jerusalem. What's the truth? Like, what are we supposed to do? And Jesus just completely disarms this question, because historically it had been, it's this one or that one. And Jesus is like, yeah, both, and neither. And so we see that as now the temple is gone again. Jesus's response actually was, a day is coming and is now here when all people will worship in spirit and truth. Which is kind of an enigmatic response, but like I said, it's a yes and both and neither, because a little bit later the temple becomes destroyed again, and now there's no sacrifices. But what we know about our faith is that that we are now the temple of God, and so wherever we find ourselves, whether it's at a mountain or whether it's in Jerusalem or wherever we may find ourselves, is a place for us to worship, because God's presence is everywhere and within us and among us. And so I connect these stories together, and I see this fear as the people, in the book of Ezra, as they come back to Jerusalem, this fear of the other, and they're still struggling with this identity of, well, Jerusalem is where we're supposed to worship. And it led to this tension that became the tension between the Jewish people and the Samaritans that we see in the New Testament. And I think that there's a lot that we can learn from that, and learn from the way that Jesus responded to that very same question and that tension. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoy Ezra. I would encourage you to not just read the assigned text for this one, but to read a couple chapters, the whole chapters that are referenced, as well as a chapter or two after, to get some context of what's going on. If you like these videos, if you appreciate them, please comment on them. Please like the videos, subscribe, and hit the bell so that you get notified anytime I put something out. I put one of these out every week, just talking about what's going on in the narrative lectionary. And then occasionally I talk a little bit about monastic life in general. So subscribe so you can hear more about that. Thanks so much.